Hi, welcome to the second of three lectures on language. This lecture deals with language and communications technology. Communication technology and its effects on everyday life is an important new topic in cultural anthropology. This works in a number of ways. First, the use of communication technology is leading to the development of new sets of forms of language and norms regarding its usage in different forums. Some of this is touched on in the Mellor article. Texting, social media, phone calls, emails. We use all these different forms of communication differently, and the language we use in these different contexts varies too. We'll look at an interesting example of that a bit later. In addition, there is the incorporation of communications technology into our lives, particularly in the form of the cell phone. In this lecture, I'm going to cover some of these topics. First, we'll look at the example of an anthropologist who has studied cell phone usage, and then we'll address the use of language in texting and how we might think about that. Anthropologists are studying the way communication technology is embedded into people's everyday lives. One famous example of someone who does this kind of work is Jan Chipchase, a Dutch anthropologist who worked for the cell phone company Nokia. He and his team traveled around the globe conducting fieldwork on the many different ways in which people use cell phones. As his team discovered, how people use, decorate, and act in regard to their phones is very much impacted by local cultural conditions. Moreover, Chipchase found that people use technology in inventive ways to meet challenges posed by their social and cultural contexts. Finally, the team found that having a cell phone gave people a fixed point, a number, where they could be reached when displaced by war, famine, or natural disaster, or when pushed to move around for economic reasons. So cell phones help provide people an identity that could be accessed by other people, even in turbulent times. Let's go through some specific examples of what Chipchase and his team found. First, Chipchase and his team found that cell phone usage is incredibly widespread across the world and across individual societies. Indeed, cell phones are as present in rural areas in the global south, like in Amazonian villages, or in this case, in rural Uganda, as they are in Europe or North America. These are pictures of mobile cell phone repair setups in Delhi, in India. One thing that Chipchase and his team found is that in many places, informal cell phone repair is very common, as it is cheaper and easier to access than the kind of official cell phone repair store we might be used to. In fact, other anthropologists have found this to be true in underserviced areas in the United States. There's one study on Washington, D.C., that looks at how teenagers in particular learn and teach each other how to repair phones, which provides them both a modest income and a sense of status and accomplishment. All this is true in places like Delhi. People who have the expertise to be able to repair cell phones quickly and cheaply, even if they don't have degrees in engineering or computer science, are well respected and valued members of the community, and their mobile cell phone repair setups are often social centers and hubs of activity. Chipchase and his team also found that people use cell phones for all sorts of interesting functions. For instance, in some places, like rural Uganda, where there are not strong banking systems, people transfer money using credits for cell phone calling time. This is a photo of the ledger of a middleman who helps do this. If you want to transfer money from the city to the countryside, for instance, you might pay this man money, which he will use to purchase cell phone credits and then transfer them to your family member. They can then either use these or use a rural middleman to convert them into cash. Here's another example of something like this. In places like rural Uganda, where official house numbering systems are absent, people use their cell phone numbers as house numbers. If you know someone's number, you'll be able to identify their house if you have its rough location. People's attitudes towards their phones themselves very much reflect local cultural conditions. For instance, even pre-pandemic, people in Japan and Korea were much more concerned about the role that cell phones might play in transmitting viruses or bacteria than we are. So much so that there are hygienic wipes installed in bathrooms right next to toilet paper. There are also publicly available cell phone disinfecting stations that look a bit like microwaves. In these ways, people's attitudes towards their cell phones reflect broader attitudes towards disease and hygiene. Finally, there are clear differences across cultures in how much people decorate and accessorize their cell phones. Strap usage varies greatly over space, as does how often and how extravagantly people decorate their cell phones. This is much more common in Asia than in Europe, and even less common in North America and the United States. Cell phones have transformed people's everyday lives across the globe. Indeed, as of a couple of years ago, more people in the world had access to cell phones than to working toilets. So this is a revolutionary technology. Importantly, it's also a cultural revolution of sorts. Cell phones reflect how we think about ourselves and our relationships to others, but they also help transform those things. They make us more locatable, more modern, more social, but also maybe more isolated. All this is grist for anthropology, and more anthropologists, not just employees of cell phone firms like Chip Chase, but academic anthropologists interested in all sorts of topics, are focusing on cell phone usage among the people they study. Let's shift gears a bit and look at the kind of language that people use when using their cell phones, particularly when they text. This is a new area of language use and one that impacts all of our lives. How do anthropologists understand this? What does it tell us about language in general or culture in general? To get at this, I want you to reflect on the answers you and your classmates gave to the questions I posed on the discussion board. I'll bet between all of you, you listed dozens and maybe hundreds of texting abbreviations. You should note that when I first started doing this exercise about 10 years ago, there were usually a couple of dozen abbreviations, but the number of these has exploded. Second, I'll bet you were able to identify some rules of texting, quote unquote. Like, it's probably not the best to have serious and lengthy conversations via text. It's probably not a good idea to break up with someone via text or deal with a major family issue that way. Texting tends to be used for more short, informal, and/or logistical communications. Meet me here. Pick this up at the store. Note that these rules exist even though no centralized authority imposed them. They've developed naturally and through day-to-day interaction. Finally, I'll bet that many of you wrote that texting is debasing our language use. With texting, we see lots of ungrammatical constructions, misspellings, errors of capitalization, and so on. So it's pretty common for people to lament what texting is doing to how we use language. I, along with many anthropologists and linguists, want to challenge this idea. In the following video, the linguist John McWhorter makes the argument that texting is actually a miraculous form of communication, one we should celebrate. As you watch it, think about his argument and what we have learned about language thus far. Its dynamism, its creativity. Okay, here comes the video.
We always hear that texting is a scourge. The idea is that texting spells the decline and fall of any kind of serious literacy, or at least writing ability, among young people in the United States and now the whole world today. The fact of the matter is that it just isn't true. And it's easy to think that it is true, but in order to see it in another way, in order to see that actually texting is a miraculous thing, not just energetic, but a miraculous thing, a kind of emergent complexity that we're seeing happening right now, we have to pull the camera back for a bit and look at what language really is. In which case, one thing that we see is that texting is not writing at all. What do I mean by that? Basically, if we think about language, language has existed for perhaps 150,000 years, at least 80,000 years. And what it arose as is speech. People talked. That's what we're probably genetically specified for. That's how we use language most. Writing is something that came along much later. And as we saw in the last talk, there's a little bit of controversy as to exactly when that happened. But according to traditional estimates, if humanity had existed for 24 hours, then writing only came along at about 11:07 p.m. That's how much of a latterly thing writing is. So, first there's speech, and then writing comes along as a kind of artifice. Now, don't get me wrong, writing has certain advantages. When you write, because it's a conscious process, because you can look backwards, you can do things with language that are much less likely if you're just talking. For example, imagine a passage from Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The whole engagement lasted above 12 hours till the gradual retreat of the Persians was changed into a disorderly flight, of which the shameful example is given by the principal leaders and the Serenus himself. That's beautiful, but let's face it, nobody talks that way. Or, at least, they shouldn't if they're interested in reproducing. That is not the way any human being speaks casually. Casual speech is something quite different. Linguists have actually shown that when we're speaking casually in an unmonitored way, we tend to speak in word packets of maybe 7 to 10 words. You'll notice this if you ever have occasion to record yourself or a group of people talking. That's what speech is like. Speech is much looser. It's much more telegraphic. It's much less reflective. Very different from writing. So we naturally tend to think, because we see language written so often, that that's what language is. But actually, what language is speech. They're two things. Now, of course, as history has gone by, it's been natural for there to be a certain amount of bleed between speech and writing. So, for example, in a distant era now, it was common when one gave a speech to basically talk like writing. So I mean the kind of speech that you see someone giving in an old movie where they clear their throat and they go, ladies and gentlemen, and then they speak in a certain way, which has nothing to do with casual speech. It's formal. It uses long sentences like this given one. It's basically talking like you write. And so, for example, we're thinking so much these days about Lincoln because of the movie. The Gettysburg Address was not the main meal of that event. For 2 hours before that, Edward Everett spoke on a topic that frankly cannot engage us today and barely did then. The point of it was to listen to him speaking like writing. Ordinary people stood and listened to that for 2 hours. It was perfectly natural. That's what people did then, speaking like writing. Well, if you can speak like writing, then logically it follows that you might want to also sometimes write like you speak. The problem was just that in the material, mechanical sense, that was harder back in the day, for the simple reason that materials don't lend themselves to it. It's almost impossible to do that with your hand, except in shorthand, and then communication is limited. On a manual typewriter, it was very difficult, and even when we had electric typewriters, or then computer keyboards, the fact is that even if you can type easily enough to keep up with the pace of speech, more or less, you have to have somebody who can receive your message quickly. Once you have things in your pocket that can receive that message, then you have the conditions that allow that we can write like we speak. And that's where texting comes in. And so, texting is very loose in its structure. No one thinks about capital letters or punctuation when one texts. But then again, do you think about those things when you talk? No. And so therefore, why would you when you were texting? What texting is, despite the fact that it involves the brute mechanics of something that we call writing, is fingered speech. That's what texting is. Now we can write the way we talk. And it's a very interesting thing, but nevertheless easy to think that still it represents some sort of decline. We see this general bagginess of the structure, the lack of concern with rules in the way that we're used to learning on the blackboard. And so we think that something has gone wrong. It's a very natural sense. But the fact of the matter is that what is going on is a kind of emergent complexity. That's what we're seeing in this fingered speech. And in order to understand it, what we want to see is the way in this new kind of language there is new structure coming up. And so, for example, there is in texting a convention, which is LOL. Now, LOL we generally think of as meaning laughing out loud. And of course, theoretically, it does. And if you look at older texts, then people used it to actually indicate laughing out loud. But if you text now, or if you are someone who's aware of the substrate of texting the way it's become, you'll notice that LOL does not mean laughing out loud anymore. It's evolved into something that is much subtler. This is an actual text that was done by a non-male person of about 20 years old not too long ago. I love the font you're using, BTW. Julie, lol, thanks, Gmail is being slow right now. Now, if you think about it, that's not funny. No one's laughing. And yet there it is. So you assume there's been some kind of hiccup. Then Susan says, lol, I know. Again, more guffawing than we're used to when you're talking about these inconveniences. So Julie says, I just sent you an email. Susan, lol, I see it. Very funny people if that's what LOL means. This Julie says, so what's up? Susan, lol, I have to write a 10-page paper. She's not amused. Let's think about it. Lol is being used in a very particular way. It's a marker of empathy. It's a marker of accommodation. We linguists call things like that pragmatic particles. Any spoken language that's used by real people has them. If you happen to speak Japanese, think about that little word ne that you use at the end of a lot of sentences. If you listen to the way black youth today speak, think about the use of the word yo. Whole dissertations could be written about it, and probably are being written about it. A pragmatic particle, that's what lol has gradually become. It's a way of using the language between actual people. Another example is slash. Now, we can use slash in the way that we're used to, along the lines of we're going to have a party slash networking session. That's kind of like what we're at. Slash is used in a very different way in texting among young people today. It's used to change the scene. So, for example, this Sally person says, so, I need to find people to chill with. And Jake says, ha ha. You could write a dissertation about ha ha too, but we don't have time for that. Ha ha, so you're going by yourself. Why? Sally, for this summer program at NYU. Jake, ha ha, slash, I'm watching this video with Suns players trying to shoot with one eye. The slash is interesting. I don't really even know what Jake is talking about after that, but you notice that he's changing the topic. Now, that seems kind of mundane, but think about how in real life, if we're having a conversation and we want to change the topic, there are ways of doing it gracefully. You don't just zip right into it. You'll pat your thighs and look wistfully off into the distance. Or you'll say something like, makes you think, when it really didn't. But what you're really what you're really trying to do is change the topic. You can't do that while you're texting, and so ways are developing of doing it within this medium. All spoken languages have what a linguist calls a new information marker, or 2 or 3. Texting has developed one from this slash. So, we have a whole battery of new constructions that are developing, and yet it's easy to think, well, something is still wrong. There's a lack of structure of some sort. It's not as sophisticated as the language of the Wall Street Journal. Well, the fact of the matter is, look at this person in 1956, and this is when texting doesn't exist. I Love Lucy is still on the air. Many do not know the alphabet or multiplication table, cannot write grammar. We've heard that sort of thing before. Not just in 1956, 1917, Connecticut school teacher. 1917. This is the time when we all assumed that everything somehow in terms of writing was perfect because the people on Downton Abbey are articulate or something like that. So, from every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate, and so on. You can go even further back than this. It's the president of Harvard. It's 1871. There's no electricity. People have 3 names. Bad spelling. Incorrectness as well as inelegance of expression in writing, and he's talking about people who are otherwise well prepared for college studies. You can go even further back. 1841, some long-lost superintendent of schools is upset because of what he has for a long time noted with regret, the almost entire neglect of the original blah, 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 blah. Or you can go all the way back to 63 AD, and there's this poor man who doesn't like the way people are speaking Latin. As it happens, he was writing about what had become French. And so, there are always There are always people worrying about these things, and the planet somehow seems to keep spinning. And so, the way I'm thinking of texting these days is that what we're seeing is a whole new way of writing that young people are developing, which they're using alongside their ordinary writing skills. And that means that they're able to do two things. Increasing evidence is that being bilingual is cognitively beneficial. That's also true of being bidialectal. That's certainly true of being bidialectal in terms of your writing. And so texting actually is evidence of a balancing act that young people are using today. Not consciously, of course, but it's an expansion of their linguistic repertoire. It's very simple. If somebody from 1973 looked at what was on a dormitory message board in 1993, the slang would have changed a little bit since the era of Love Story, but they would understand what was on that message board. Take that person from 1993, not that long ago. This is, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Those people. Take those people and they read a very typical text written by a 20-year-old today. Often they would have no idea what half of it meant because a whole new language has developed among our young people doing something as mundane as what it looks like to us when they're batting around on their little devices. So, in closing, if I could go into the future, if I could go into 2033, first thing I would ask is whether David Simon had done a sequel to The Wire. I would want to know. And I really would ask that. And then I'd want to know actually what was going on Downton Abbey. That'd be the second thing. And then the third thing would be, please show me a sheaf of texts written by 16-year-old girls, because I would want to know where this language had developed since our times. And ideally, I would then send them back to you and me now so we could examine this linguistic miracle happening right under our noses. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This video speaks for itself, but I want to emphasize that most cultural and linguistic anthropologists agree with McWhorter in his emphasis on the creativity and dynamism in the development of texting. Rather than seeing it as debasing the language, anthropologists see it as another example of how humans generate cultural forms that allow us to accomplish things, communicate in this case, in new and powerful ways. In this case, texting allows us to write like we speak. This fingered speech is an entirely new form of language, a new structure with new conventions. But there are, of course, dangers here, some of which are discussed in the Meller article. We all know from experience that online communication has its risks. For instance, it's hard to convey emotion since we are not face to face and can't observe facial expressions or gestures that might indicate sarcasm or sympathy. Emojis and specific linguistic conventions like the use of LOL are efforts to solve this problem. So, to conclude, I just want to highlight that this is a new and exciting area of cultural anthropology. More and more anthropologists are incorporating social media and online life and communication into their work as a matter of course. For instance, in my work on the High Line Park in New York City, I use traditional ethnographic techniques like participant observation and interviews, but I also systematically follow Twitter in order to understand how people experience the park. Tweets sent as people walk along the park are a great source of virtual data on how the real world is working. Okay, that's our second lecture on language. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you next time.